Well, speaking of Jung, um, a friend of mine a little while ago, he's kind of a new psychotherapist, and I think he's still trying to figure out like what kind of therapist he's going to be. And so we talk about people like Jung and Hillman, and folks like that quite a bit. He said to me, uh, called me up one day, and he said, "You know what? Jung is my religion." Like he like found it.
Mm.
And my immediate reaction was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, like slow down." And it kind of like shocked me to hear that. But then later, it's like once you hear something, you see it everywhere, or you start to hear it everywhere. And I realized that this is, I think, an idea that's going around is that Jungian psychology can be a replacement for religion because people are like rejecting particularly Christianity or whatever religion they inherited. And but this is like, oh, well, Jungian psychology or archetypal psychology in particular can give you everything that you get from religion and without all of like the kind of the dogma and belief and all that stuff. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think you've certainly named something that's pervasive, and Jungians in particular are the source of this. By Jungians, I mean trained analysts and who have, for whatever reason, found everything in their psychoanalytical practice. Jung himself is a little bit more subtle than that and typically pulls back from saying, I'm offering a substitute for religion. What he actually says is, I'm offering something for people who, for whatever reason, have no religion. And he specified
Mhm.
Protestantism because he thought Catholics, they've got everything they need. They got the devil, they got Mary, they've got the crucified Savior, and they've got redemption and the priest and the mass and the whole symbolic.
Confession,
Yeah, they don't need psychotherapy. So
right?
his candidate for psychotherapy was a sort of what would we call a lapsed Protestant, you know, a Protestant who no longer goes to church and just regards it as some kind of
Like
moral
himself.
practice. Yeah, yeah, that's right. And because Jung actually saw that there was something about European modernity uh, which needed this kind of treatment because of this is related to the secular, the moment of demythologization, the disenchantment of the world, the commodification of everything, the hegemony of technology, the reduction of everything to quantity. Jung is very keenly sensitive to this as a massive psychological shift, at least in one portion of humanity. He didn't assume that everybody was going through this, but he certainly saw that this is what was happening to, let's say, Protestant Christendom, and that this was a crisis, and that because the mythic life, the symbolic life, which is a better term, mythic, I prefer to talk about the symbolic life. We need a symbolic life, and we need a symbolic life that's actually adequate to the fullness of our beings. So the transcendent needs to be somehow represented for us, however inadequately. And if it isn't, uh, you know, curious and even pathological things will happen. So he was addressing that problem. And then I guess it's somehow ironic that the upshot of it is that he suddenly becomes a new form of religion, which it just doesn't work. It's not it's just not complete enough. It's too shot through with scientism. And there's a kind of hubris to it too, to say that
Yeah.
the psychoanalysis has now kind of lifted us above the human religion, which is as old as humanity, at least 200,000 years old. Now we have a better perspective. So we look down on all this. That's just rationalism, right? It's just an elevated form of rationalism.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I never quite thought of it that way, but it does seem hubristic because what belief in psychology, what it allows us to do is to kind of understand and deal with all the problematic aspects of life. Like all the questions can kind of be answered according to your own preferences in a way,
Mm.
because psychology, there is no doctrine. You can just kind of like pick and choose, whatever mythological figures appeal to you, whatever Greek gods
That's
and
right.
goddesses appeal to you. You just kind of like choose your own pantheon kind of thing.
And it serves that narcissistic, egocentric sin we were talking about, which is the
Well,
one thing.
because there's no
Yeah,
surrender.
that's right. It's the one thing that can stand between us and grace or Buddha nature, um, is that sense that actually I'm in charge. And that
Hmm.
this is what disturbs me most about that Jungian psychology being
Yeah.
a religion.
Like I'm in charge of my individuation
Yeah,
process. My analyst is like my priest substitute. I go do confession with them. I read Jung as, reading of the scriptures kind of thing. But the piece of it that's lacking is the surrender to something greater.
that's right.
Someone
And
might say, well, the big S self, I surrendered to, or I surrendered to psyche. Psyche, I follow psyche or something. But I don't know. It still sounds contained in the individual to me.
I mean, it's interesting to note how Jung had a great deal of trouble with that moment of surrender. Yeah,
Oh,
let's
that great story, almost like a parable
mhm,
of him not being able to touch his head to the ground,
yes,
following his father's full surrender, right? To I
that's
think
right.
Protestant. You say it.
Protestantism. Yeah.
Protestantism. Yes, I've never
Well,
said that.
and
Would I?
when Jung is really speaks personally about religion, he always pulls back and says, "I'm a scientist. I don't believe." He might say, "I don't believe I know," or he'll say, I'm actually just speaking about facts. I'm doing science, whatever." And his real faith is in science. I mean, it's very strange to say because Jung is not regarded as the most rationally rigorous of thinkers, but he's got as much faith in science as does Freud. And this is a limitation, especially if we want to take him as a guide in matters that go beyond, let's say, psychotherapy. And there's a lot more to life than psychotherapy.
I hope so. Yeah, like Hillman would say, like two people talking about their problems in a windowless room
Yeah,
as like the ship is sinking.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I guess what that kind of makes me think about is that idea that Jung had, and when things are encapsulated like this, it never captures the full context of how he talked about things, which is, I think, one of the problems with kind of dipping into Jung. A lot of his stuff is taken out of context, and so then therefore misinterpreted. But one thing that he did talk about was how religion acted as a kind of buffer between us and the direct experience with the numinous or with God,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
all the rituals and dogma were actually a kind of protection from
Hmm.
us getting completely overwhelmed by that
Hmm.
experience. And following like what we've been talking about, I think if we flip that around, that the psychology itself can be a kind of protection or defense against
Hmm.
the numinous experience in a way.
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
do you see that? Is that
I certainly, in the sense that it leaves the ego master of its house, or the self, which is just, one wonders.
it's the inflated ego?
Yeah. Um, that said, I mean, these are difficult matters. I like very much what you said about the context. Jung's movement was a living practice. He was someone who was enmeshed in a community of thinkers and disciples, of course, and students. But it was it was something that was really alive. And all of his writings were occasional writings, responses to something. Someone would ask him, "Oh, give us a paper on
Yeah,
Mercurius," and
he's very
yeah,
reactive. Hmm.
yeah, he did. He's not at all like Freud in that regard. Where Freud would, after 8 hours of practicing analysis, he would write all evening, trying to master a kind of systematic overview of the metapsychology. And Freud is an incredible writer and systematician. Jung was not like this, and his editors actually recognized that, his English editors, and they did something really strange. They said, "Well, what we'll do is we'll put the systematic structure onto these occasional fragmentary writings
Hmm.
so that we can show that he's every bit as systematic and rigorous a thinker as Freud's." So you get the collected works of Jung, which read like, some kind of system. Uh, but that's and many pieces were left out. So there's a scholarly reconstruction of Jung happening right now, which is quite exciting. And apparently, there's what was left out exceeds greatly what was included in the collected works.
Hmm.
Um, Even the fact that the collected works they're not even put together chronologically, actually just indicates something peculiar happening here. So you have a
Yeah.
volume, Psychology and Religion, and it's pieces taken from all these different periods and contexts. So
Yeah, it does seem to be like someone's journal entries kind of all pasted
yeah,
together. Like he's very stream of consciousness when he writes.
he is, and he's full of genius, and he's full of insight,
Hmm.
and he belongs to our time in a very special way. And for
Yeah.
that reason, I'm not done. I'm not done with him.
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever be done with him. He's too complicated and intriguing. Like he keeps drawing me back. Like even James Hillman, I find the same way.
Mm,
At some point, I just get so fed up with him that I put him away for a while. But then I find myself being like kind of lured back
mm.
by some of his
Yeah, right.
ideas.
Well, for me, Jung is one of Jung's most important roles is that he maintains this link with the 19th century, the
Hmm.
rich history of 19th century Romantic psychiatry, and behind that, the whole history of European modernity from the Renaissance onward. You know, Jung keeps that alive. That's Jung's context, but Freud was deliberately shutting that down and replacing it with something that he thought was more rigorously scientific, his model of the psyche, which is emphatically not religious. Jung was a conservative movement to say, on the contrary, there's a lot of psychoanalysis in 19th century German philosophy, for example, and German Romanticism. The unconscious is a concept that's richly articulated and defined 100 years before Freud writes a single word. So Jung is maintaining that. We look
Hmm.
at his collective unconscious theory, we think it's some kind of innovation. Every theory of the unconscious prior to Freud was the theory of the collective unconscious. Every single one that I know of. Freud was unique in personalizing and reducing the unconscious to the life of an individual. So what Jung was doing was giving his vote of allegiance to the tradition against
Hmm.
Freud.
Yeah, I think you highlight something that I found to be true is that Jung is like an incredible guide to the whole history of Western culture and its
That's right.
development and changes of consciousness within it. Like everything's in there. Like he's willing to wrestle with the religious problem, like post Nietzsche, like God is dead. Okay, well, what are we going to do about that? And what are the implications of that? And then reporting on the ground, during the world wars and post war and kind of seeing into the future where it's all leading. I mean, incredible. Like the scope of his thinking. The only person that I think comes even close is someone like Rudolf Steiner.
Oh, that's a good comparison. They were contemporaries, although they had nothing to do with each other.
I know, like, look, they had to have met or been thinking about each other, but I haven't been find any evidence that there's been any interaction. But I can't believe that. Like, were their
Well,
egos just too great that they were like, I'm staying away from that guy?
yes,
Yeah,
and their movements were in competition.
yeah.
It was not ignorance of each other; it was actually avoidance of each other. But what you say makes me think that the person for whom the person that whose only religious guide in life is Jung is really not doing that badly, because through Jung you can find your way into everything. And if Jung is their gateway into the history of the West, um, right back to ancient Gnosticism,
Yeah.
well, that's not so bad. you know.
Yeah. But I think the thing is, you have to go all the way with him. Like when he
Yes.
said, you don't understand anything about my psychology until you've read the Bible.
Yeah.
So, how many of those people following Jung are
Yeah.
going past reading the black books or the red book or whatever and getting kind of enthralled with these images and this story of this guy going through this journey to the unconscious and actually going back and reading the Bible, reading, the Gnostic stuff or whatever, like going back to the source text, which I think Jung would say, look, you have to go back to the source. You can't just get it all through me.
They read the answer to Job, but they don't read the book of Job.
Exactly, yeah.
Mm.
Or they listen to Jordan Peterson talk about Jung's answer to Job.
Yeah.
It's like 3 steps removed now.
Oh yeah, but this we're in a time of great illiteracy and great decline, and I think that we're one of the things we're touching on here is how rich and nuanced and complex European intellectual life was in the middle of the 20th century compared to
Hmm.
what we're dealing with now. The
Incredible.
soundbite culture, and it's something that can't be avoided. It's too big. It has to do with technology and media. On the one hand, it's wonderful. There's so much information, and there's so many ways in which one can constitute a community for themselves and cultivate their interests. But on the other hand, there is a kind of degeneration of common literacy. And
Hmm.
I think that this is why I think, you know, Jung is not the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, no, that's true because he does, in a way, help to curate your education.
That's it.
I've been studying with Thomas Moore, who you have maybe some things in common with, actually. You know, he was a monastic for
Mhm.
early part of his life and got out of it. And yeah. But so I've been studying with him for a while now. And one of the things I appreciate most about it is that he's like someone that I trust as an elder, and he's doing a basically what he's doing is curating an education for us.
Mm,
He's not delivering it so much as kind of like pointing to some very
mm,
specific texts and people, say like, if you're interested in this, kind of check this stuff out. And what that does is put a lot of the burden of the education on me, is to follow up on those leads
mm,
and then, you know, enter down these cavernous rabbit holes. You know, like you
mhm.
point to like Hillman, all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, you're wrestling with Hillman one day, and then you're wrestling with I don't know, Heraclitus or Epicurus the next day, you know. So it's a lifelong education, but it's so helpful to have someone give those pointers, you know, like these
Yeah,
people are on
yeah.
our tree if you're interested in this tree.
And what we're talking about generally, Hillman, Thomas More, um, to some degree, Peterson, certainly C.G. Jung, is the recovery of the spirituality of the West. And this is so important because we know so much about the East now. And many of us have been so transformed by their experiences with the East, with yoga, with Buddhism, and also with the North and the South, with shamanism. We are now all very religiously literate in a certain way. But the one thing that we don't know very much about is our own tradition. And there's a psychological problem there,
Hmm.
because we might be chasing after figures and teachers who really are not meant for us, in the sense that they can't really touch the depths of our being. For me, for example, you know, Jesus is a Western shaman, and Christ is a European bodhisattva. And he is the one given to post-Western society.
All right.
That's there's a place of power there that I suspect well, it could have more effect on an individual's life than uh, you know anything that you'll find elsewhere, if only because of you know the reality of our cultural heritage, of our collective
Yeah.
unconscious, if you wish, which is localized in a certain way. We're not
Yeah.
just all
It's
lost in the
specific.
sea. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah,
No, that's
so I
so
really
great.
appreciate Jung for doing this. And he said,
Mhm.
"This is my task." He traveled to India, and he realized he had a dream, I think, of the Christ, and he realized my task actually is not to recover, you know, a global religiosity, but actually to be the psychoanalyst of Western religion.
Mm.
And for that reason, because he saw the problem there, he saw the illness there.